All right, thank you, everybody. Thank you so much, Bob. It's a real pleasure to be with all of you this evening. As Bob mentioned, I'm Sharon Davies. I'm the president and CEO of the Kettering Foundation. And I've learned in my 4 years in Dayton that I should not take for granted that folks in Dayton know what the Kettering Foundation does and what it focuses on. We are almost 100 years old. We'll celebrate our centennial next year. We were founded in 1927 by Charles F. Kettering himself, and you all know, is one of the world's most prolific inventors, innovators. But despite our long presence in the Dayton region, not everyone knows what we focus on, and that's due to a number of things, I think. Probably foremost is that we have moved several times. We started off in downtown Dayton, but we moved a couple of times away from downtown, and we're now tucked away in this very beautiful sort of multi-acre retreat-like setting in Washington Township, which is delightful, but it takes us away from the activity of downtown. Another reason is, of course, that the Kettering name is so powerfully associated with health and healthcare in this area because of the great work that's done by the Kettering Health Network in the Kettering Hospital. And so it's hard to compete with that association in our minds between the Kettering name and healthcare. And of course, there's still the great work that is done by the Kettering family philanthropies in the area, which continue to support our city and in particular our arts community. So all of that is true. And so I take a little bit of time at the beginning of any speech that I give here in Dayton to talk about the work that we do at the Charles F. Kettering Foundation, work that we have been doing now for over 45 years, and that is work on the health of democracy, helping to promote the health of democracy both here in the United States and around the world. That's our singular focus. We do nothing but that. So it's my pleasure to share a few of my thoughts with you tonight about the state of democracy here in the United States as we prepare as a nation to celebrate our 250th anniversary of the signing of our Declaration of Independence just next month. Now, Bob Daly did a beautiful job, thank you, Bob, of describing the highlights of my professional career. But I thought I'd take a few minutes at the start of the evening to share some more personal facts about myself to help to explain why the work of democracy is so important to me. And that really starts because I have known pretty much all my life that I have owed an unpayable debt to a host of Americans who I never had the opportunity to meet, who took actions and made sacrifices before I was born that had direct influence and impact on the life of my family and our country, because through those actions and sacrifices, they moved our country closer to the founding aspirations that were captured in that Declaration of Independence. Some of those people that I owe that unpayable debt to are nameable, and others are nameless. For example, I am the beneficiary of the extraordinary generosity of a successful American businessman named Julius Rosenwald. Some of you may know about Julius Rosenwald, but many people don't. So it's a pleasure for me to speak about him. He lived in the late 90s, the early 1900s. He lived in Chicago, and he was the CEO of Sears Roebuck, Some of you may remember, as I do, those old student robot catalogs that used to come to our homes, right? That was the first Amazon.com. We could buy anything, and those catalogs were fabulous. Julius Rosenwald was behind that and other things at Sears. He was very successful. He made a fortune during his lifetime, and he spent much of the later years of his life thinking about what he could do with all the money that he made, because he believed that, and these are his words, there's a stage where wealth acquisition becomes a vice. And that, his words, it's a crime to pile up money after one has accumulated all that he needs for himself and his family and not do something else with it. And so I always really appreciated that about Julius Rosenwald. He didn't just say, he actually meant it, and he lived that way. And I'm the direct beneficiary of that. Julius Rosenwald, during his lifetime, became friends with Booker T. Washington. You all will remember. Booker T. Washington was the president of Tuskegee Institute down in Alabama. And there came a point when the two became friends, and Booker T. Washington told Julius Rosenwald about the dire need for public schools in the South for Black kids, because there weren't any. This is a background that is very familiar to all of us. This was during a time when Southern states didn't think very much about educating Black children. We know that before the Civil War, most of those Southern states prohibited Blacks from even learning to read and write. And after the war, Southern states refused to appropriate meaningful funds for the education of Black students. It was very common for local school boards to take all the white tax dollars and Black tax dollars and to divert the share that should have gone to the education of Black children to white schools instead. So that was the situation that Booker T. Washington was describing to Julius Rosenwald. So at his urging, Julius Rosenwald created a fund to work with communities across the South to build schools for Black children. And they were called the Rosenwald schools. My grandmother attended one of those schools when she was just 10 years old. That was the school in St. Mary, South Carolina. By the time that Julius Rosenwald was done with his gift to Black families, over 500 schools were built in South Carolina alone for Black children, and one was built in a small farming town that my grandmother was living in. And over 5,000 schools were built across the South, along with teachers' homes, due to the Rosenwald Fund. And what that meant was that Black children got to learn to read and write and got to exposed to arithmetic at a time when they otherwise wouldn't have. And many Black Americans with notable names like John Lewis, Maya Angelou, Medgar Evers went to those Rosenwald schools, as did my families. And so, as a result of that, my grandmother and later all of her children, all 8 of her children, had the chance to learn to read and write at the Rosenwald School there in St. Mary, South Carolina. Now, the generosity of Julius Rosenwald that touched the lives of my family and so many families is an extraordinary story about American philanthropy that too many of us don't know, and there's a reason for that, and I don't have time to tell you what that reason is, and so that's a story for another day. But his impactful gift was also a less honorable story at the same time. A less honorable story about the treatment of Black families, Black children across the South that made his generosity so necessary. And that, too, is a part of the story of democracy in the United States that we can't forget. So that bit was about my dad, and I want to add just a little bit more about my parents' later story. Now, as I mentioned, my dad was born into that Black family in rural South Carolina during Jim Crow. My mom was born into a white Irish Catholic family in upstate New York. This is a picture of the two of them after an army buddy of my dad's introduced them in 1955. The stars aligned, they fell in love, they decided to get married. Now, that doesn't seem very exceptional today to us. And the fact that I can even say that is a testament to how far this country has come in a relatively short period of time. But in 1955, it was very unusual. You all may remember, not many people were marrying across racial lines at that time. And in fact, in some states, it was still a crime. Interracial marriage was not a crime in New York, where the two of them got married, but it still took 4 different stops for them to find someone who was willing to marry them in New York. And more problematically for them, their marriage was still banned in states in the South, and my father was stationed at Fort Benning in Columbus, Georgia, at the time that they got married. So as an adult, I have thought a lot about the courage that it took my parents to swim against the current in the way in which they did. And for my dad to settle my mom into a small flat outside that military base in 1955. They could have been thrown in prison for that at that time. But they were very lucky, and that didn't happen. My eldest sister was born in Columbus, Georgia the next year. It might actually have been her birth that caused my father to finally decide to leave the military and to move his family back up to the north. It was more than a decade after they got married when the United States Supreme Court finally decided that case called Loving against Virginia, 1967, where they struck down those laws that criminalized their marriage as unconstitutional. By that time, my parents already had 6 kids. They were raising in Massachusetts. So obviously, I was too young to fight for those changes in our society at that time. Other Americans were involved in those fights for me and for us, our country. And because of their willingness to engage in those fights, they chipped away at those laws during Jim Crow and a whole bunch of other real bad laws during Jim Crow too. Laws that discriminated against Black Americans like my family and constricted their life chances. So I have long understood that I am the beneficiary of work like that, and I owe a debt that I will never be able to repay to the Americans who did that work for us. The best I can do would be to honor their efforts and their bravery and their sacrifices by finding some way to pay forward in some other way. So that explains why I was so honored 4 years ago to accept the offer to lead the work of the Kettering Foundation with its focus on democracy. Now, I'm certain that my father's experience in that Rosenwald school that he got to go to alongside his siblings was what instilled in him a deep belief in the value of education. Neither of my parents were college educated, but they believed in the transformative power of education, and they passed that belief on to their 6 children. All of their 6 children got college degrees. 5 of the 6 received advanced degrees. The 6th graduated at the top of his class in the police academy and designed for his police force the professional certification process. So I mention that not as a boast about my family, but as to make the point that once our country began to eliminate the barriers that stood between some of its citizens and opportunity, amazing things were able to happen in just one generation. Just one. So what does that all have to do with America at 250? Well, the story of American democracy, I want to say to you tonight, is a story that has always required its citizens to push it in the direction of the aspirations that were captured by our founding fathers laid out in that Declaration of Independence in 1776. Even though our founding fathers at that time could not themselves live up to the aspirations that they articulated. So we all know we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We all know, too, that our nation, for much of its 250-year-long history, did not live up to those words. Many Americans didn't fully enjoy equality and the liberties that the Declaration spoke of. Democracy was more of an idea at that moment than it was a practice at our founding. Native Americans weren't even a consideration, as we know. African Americans were still enslaved in 1776. It would take a bloody civil war and another 100 years after Jim Crow to secure equal rights for Black people, women, a full half of the population. We did not enjoy rights of citizenship until we won the vote in 1920, and from there, we had to continue along for equality for women. Scholars say, because of all that, the United States did not truly become a full democracy until the middle of the 20th century, until the passage of the civil rights legislation in the 1960s, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Fair Housing Act of 1968. So our nation has become more democratic as we became more democratically minded people. And that took time. And here's the point. It has always been the result of engaged citizens who are willing to press the country for that progress, often at great risk to themselves, sometimes at the cost of their lives, and always knowing that they would be met with resistance because others disagreed that that was progress that they wanted in the first place. So the fight of the abolitionists and the suffragists and the civil rights activists, and after them, gay rights activists, advocates for persons with disabilities, that's the story of our nation's progress. It's a 250-year-long story of our movement from a nation that began at its founding allowing only about 6% of the population to participate in the exercise of self-government. The wealthiest of white men, only 6% of our citizens, to one that now includes all of its adult citizens. So that's quite a record that's quite a record of progress that we can be very proud of. And with the benefit of hindsight, I know that every single person in this room can see today that there was valor in the acts of the abolitionists who fought for the end of slavery. There was valor in the acts of the suffragists who fought for the rights of women. There was valor in the acts of the civil rights activists who fought for a more just nation. But we also remember that they didn't have a lot of company when they were doing what they did. That's actually what made them brave. They had to do it without a big crowd of supporters behind them. Far from it, in fact. The abolitionists were threatened with violence, ostracism, imprisonment. The suffragists were ridiculed and arrested, and when they went on hunger strikes in jail, they were fed by force. The freedom fighters boarded buses with no promise that they would return home, and some of them didn't. Students who sat down at those lunch counters were beaten. Marchers were met with billy clubs and German shepherds and fire hoses. So the story of democracy in the United States is a story about courage and persistence and patriotism in the face of resistance. Courage, because we know from this history of ours that work in advancement of democracy was frequently dangerous. Persistence, because often the people on those front lines didn't live long enough to enjoy the fruits of what it was that they were fighting for. And patriotism, because being able to be critical of one's own government, one's nation's failings, and demand that it do better is the hallmark of patriotism. So let me shift to today and our fast approaching anniversary and see if I can connect up some of what I've just said to what it is that we're thinking about today. I don't think I'm breaking news to you all to say that as we approach our semi-quincentennial, I really like to say that, semi-quincentennial, our nation is currently involved in a battle for its democracy. And it is once again turning to its citizens to help secure it. I don't think that's breaking news to anybody, but in case you need evidence of it, let me just cite a bit of that. When the foundation first shifted its focus to democracy in the late 1970s and in the early 1980s, things were looking very good for democracy worldwide. The collapse of the Soviet Union, the Arab Spring, where all those protests were happening across North Africa and the Middle East, protests against autocrats. Democracy was on the rise all across the globe. And we believe that those trend lines are going to continue. That was the case in the 1980s. But we now know that that was wildly over-optimistic. Some of you are familiar with the work of Freedom House. Freedom House every year publishes the Freedom in the World Index. That index has shown us that we have been living in a time of great peril for democracies across the world for the last 20 years running. That this is under this index that looks at democratic freedoms, political rights in different countries, civil liberties enjoyed by citizens in different countries, has concluded in its latest report in 2026 that decline has continued this past year. This index rates nations as free, partly free, or not free. And the United States is a nation that is listed as free, but 54 countries have registered declines just over the last year, while only 35 countries improved worldwide. This was based on data that was collected through the end of 2025 and didn't include events that have happened elsewhere and here in 2026. In 2002, the United States in that index had a score of 93 out of 100 on the Freedom Index. By the end of 2025, its score had dropped to 81 out of 100. That puts us behind Argentina and Panama and on par with South Africa, Jamaica, and Suriname. The decline, Freedom House says, stems from a number of things, including chronic partisan gridlock, dysfunction in Congress, escalating assertions of unilateral authority by the executive branch, increasing reprisals for political speech, government punishment for nonviolent expressions by citizens and non-citizens, disregard for conflicts of interest, and a weakening of anti-corruption safeguards. There's another organization called the VDEM Institute that looks at democracy worldwide. It's a global watchdog organization for democracy. And this is what the cover of VDEM's 2026 report looks like this year. It's a picture of a battered American flag with SOS inked across it. And inside that report, VDEM warned that for the average global citizen worldwide, democracy was now down to 1978 levels. And under the presidency of Donald Trump, democracy in the United States has fallen to the level that it stood at in 1965, according to VDEM. It also made special note of the speed with which American democracy is being dismantled in the United States as unprecedented in modern history. That is also something that a number of the nation's top scholars on authoritarianism and strongman leadership are telling us as well. A number of the best scholars are senior fellows at the Kettering Foundation. One is Ruth Ben-Gia. You might see her from time to time on television. She's the author of Strong Men, how strong men rise, why they succeed, how they fall. Timothy Snyder, you may know of his work. He wrote that wonderful book on tyranny. He's a professor of history, formerly at Yale. Steve Levitsky, the author of How Democracies Die. All three of them are our senior fellows. All of them have been sounding the alarms about the state of our democracy today as we approach that anniversary. They are asked constantly by people, how will we know? How will we know when we're close to the line or when we cross the line and lose our democracy? And Steve Levitsky provided a very useful test. It's a simple one. It's the question, is there a risk or a cost to a citizen standing up and opposing their government? In a democracy, that should not be a risk. There should not be a cost to that free speech embedded in our Constitution. So he proposed that as a test. Now, the Kettering Foundation, I want to say very quickly, is a nonpartisan, nonprofit foundation. We take that very seriously. Among our senior fellows are some of the most respected conservative voices in the country. David French, Bill Kristol, Sarah Longwell, Judge Michael Ludwig, Maureen O'Connor. You will recognize them and know their contributions. They too are sounding the alarms about our democracy and the effect that our current executive administration is having on it. So we are nonpartisan at the Kettering Foundation, which means we don't align with any particular party, we don't endorse parties, we don't endorse candidates, we don't oppose parties or candidates, but we're not neutral when it comes to the issue of democracy in the United States and the things that put it in peril. So we've been careful in our thinking about this question that our scholars and public intellectuals are alerting us about. How close are we really to losing our democracy? How worried should we be? After all, our democracy survived the first term of Donald Trump. Our Freedom House and VDEM Institute and these scholars and public intellectuals just catastrophizing. Are they worrying too much? Well, during the first term of Donald Trump, a group of scholars were worried then. And they wrote this book. This is called Can It Happen Here? Authoritarianism in America. And the whole thing was a series of essays that were contributed by some of our best thinkers in the United States on that question. One of them was Eric Posner. He's a professor at the University of Chicago, highly respected professor of law. And he concluded during the first term of Donald Trump that the fears were overblown. And that, at least at that time, they were overblown. And he explained why. He argued that to take down democracy in the United States was more than a notion. And that to accomplish that, President Trump would have to take an everywhere, everything, all at once approach to an assault on our democracy to become anything more than just an aspiring autocrat. And without that multi-front approach or attack on our democracy, Posner thought that we would survive it, that President Trump would be stopped by the stronghold of democratic institutions that our founders wisely put in place when they created those founding documents, precisely to prevent despotic rule in the United States. So Posner described the kind of multi-front attack that he thought would be necessary to defeat democracy in the United States. And it looked like this. The president would have to simultaneously, he said, attack the press, silence Congress, use the Department of Justice, FBI, CIA, IRS to harass his opponents, replace loyal civil servants with loyalists, co-opt the military, subdue the judiciary, impose his will on state and local governments, dominate the Republican Party, attack civil society, and create a mob that was willing to do his bidding. And all those things, Posner thought, would have to happen in order for our democracy to be put in jeopardy. Now, I haven't had a chance to talk to Professor Posner about what he thinks about this now, but within the first 100 days of Donald Trump's second term, his list looked like a running roll call to me of Donald Trump's executive orders. Check, 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 check. Off of that list. So if Posner was right, then maybe we do have something that all Americans should be concerned about. That was on my mind just a few weeks ago when I was on my way to Denmark for the Copenhagen Democracy Summit. And when I got there, I have to tell you, I was unprepared for what happened at the very start of that summit. Some of you may have heard about it in the news or read about it. When a former Prime Minister of Denmark took the podium and announced the creation of a new global alliance of democracies called the Democracy 7, or D7, as they are calling themselves. The D7. The D7 includes Australia, Canada, the European Union, Japan, New Zealand, South Korea, and the United Kingdom. The alliance of those democracies, the foreign minister, the prime minister said was needed because of the rupture that has occurred in the post-World War II order. Conspicuously missing, of course, was the United States, which the Prime Minister, this is him, Prime Minister Rasmussen, went on to say had become a part of the axis of autocracies that had been consolidating in the world. Now you can imagine how hard that landed on Americans who were sitting in the room at that time. Former allies of the United States now answering the question that Professor Levitsky gave us a few minutes ago about are we close to losing our democracy. So while we were in Copenhagen, the team at the Kettering Foundation also had an opportunity to sit down and to talk to some local journalists there. And they were delightful. And during our conversation, they repeatedly mentioned that their nation was focusing a lot of energy on preparedness. And they said it a number of times. And so finally we asked them, what do you mean by preparedness? And they said preparedness for the possibility of a Russian invasion and the preparedness for the possibility of an American invasion of Greenland. So all those things, the report of Freedom House, the report of Freedom Institute, the alarms being told by our top scholars, the assessments of us that are being made by former allies like Denmark, makes it time for us to take stock of how close we may be to losing our democracy in the United States. And when we take stock of that, we must honestly reckon with what has been normalized in our country over the past year and a half. Since the return of Donald Trump to the White House, we have watched Americans and American institutions navigate a host of threats emanating from our own government. And we've learned how hard it is to be brave when people are threatened with the loss of their jobs, or organizations are threatened with the loss of their funding, or journalists are threatened with the loss of their access to press rooms, or critics of the president are threatened with investigation and prosecution, or immigrants are threatened by masked men in our streets with guns and no badges. Not even the powerful last year felt safe from this administration. We watched the leaders of some of our biggest law firms, multi-million-dollar corporations, some of our most prestigious news outlets, our largest universities capitulate rather than stand up to the president and suffer worse consequences. Tim Snyder, in his book on tyranny, famously wrote, "Don't obey in advance." That's what happens when democracies slide into autocracies. Don't obey in advance, but again and again, we watched organizations in the United States do just that last year. It was clear that most of them did that out of fear, and that they were making an effort to get small, to self-censor, to avoid attracting attention to themselves, to ride things out. This suggests that in answer to the question that Professor Levitsky said, that question, is there a price to pay for standing up to one's own government? Many Americans and many American institutions thought the answer to that question was yes. We watched also our legislative branch advocate its clear constitutional responsibilities to serve as a check for an overzealous executive branch in a system of checks and balances that our founding fathers carefully set in place in order to prevent an overzealous executive. And the actions of the judicial branch were more mixed last year. The lower courts were actually part of an important part of the success that the nation had in holding the line for our democracy. Many, hundreds, over 600 now, lawsuits have been brought against the federal government to try to stop different things that it has been doing in the lower federal courts have been an open ear for those lawsuits. The Supreme Court's performance has been more problematic, particularly its unprecedented reliance on its shadow docket, where it's allowed many of the administration's actions to proceed without any explanation, without any decision about why they were doing it on the merits. So, what the decision recently in the Calais case, that compounds harms made by earlier decisions of the Supreme Court, such as in the decision Trump versus the United States, which you all remember conferred absolute immunity on the President of the United States for his official acts. And all the things that can incentivize somehow was not a concern for our court. And along with the Shelby County versus Holder case, which some of you will remember, eviscerated Section 2 of the Voting Act, and the Calais case, eviscerating Section 2 of the Voting Act, the Holder case was Section 5. This most recent decision has set off a race in our southern states to rig districts that will favor only Republican candidates, despite the fact that Americans, when they're polled, don't like gerrymandering practices. But this case has set that back. And that is critics fear that this decision will lead to re-engineered maps that will diminish the voting power, in particular of Black Americans. That was the case back before the 1960s when southern states passed things like literacy tests and used poll taxes to prevent Black people from voting. So things are back. But things are also pretty amazing when we think about the demonstrations of courage that have taken place in our country over the last year and a half. We witness with new appreciation, I think, modern day courage. The kind of courage that I was talking about at the beginning of my remarks. Lawyers who step forward instead of stepping back. Retired and former judges who are standing up for the rule of law. A university, Harvard, that has drawn a line in the sand for academic freedom after others capitulated. Government workers who've resigned rather than do what the administration was asking them to do. So easily, when we think about last year, the most inspiring defense of all of our democracy was the response of everyday Americans pushing back, demonstrating in the streets, organizing boycotts, filing lawsuits, calling their elected representatives, running for office, and showing up in ways that signal that this country's connection to democratic norms remains strong. And Americans were doing more than just raising their voices. They were bearing witness to the government's aggressive actions. In Minnesota, after federal officials labeled Renee Good and Alex Preddy as domestic terrorists, it was the work of ordinary citizens that helped contest those characterizations. They pulled out their phones, they captured footage, they shared what they saw, And the record that they created as a result of that contradicted the government's claims and forced a reckoning with the truth. The federal agents that were involved in the good shooting and the petty homicides have yet to be held accountable. And there's unfortunately little reason, I think, to expect that they will be held accountable under the current administration. But everyday Americans were displaying real courage last year and this year. So let me wrap up and say this. As we celebrate our 250th anniversary next month together, we should rightfully be proud of how far our nation has come. I know I am. But the current administration in Washington, D.C. wants to gloss over how hard it was for us to become the nation that we became, and who fought against it. My family history doesn't allow me to do that same thing. I can't gloss over American history. I fully understand the magnitude of the debt that I owe to brave Americans who fought to strengthen our democracy. The truth is that not only I stand in debt to them, but we all stand in debt because of the courageous work of past Americans whose bravery moved this country forward to a better us and a stronger democracy. We all carry a debt that we will never be able to repay. The best that we can do is pay it forward as today's citizens. And in our 250th year of celebration, here's what we can do. We can remember the examples that were set by those heroic Americans. We can acknowledge and protect the current day heroes and sheroes of our lifetime who are bravely walking in the footsteps of those past Americans. And we can summon our own courage and do what we can to ensure that the system of democratic government that was passed to us will be able to lead to future generations of Americans as well. And the final thing that I think I want to say to you all is that as we look forward to next month and our celebrations, we shouldn't allow the natural differences and disagreements that there are amongst us. We shouldn't allow them to prevent us from regarding ourselves as fellow Americans and fellow patriots. The abolitionists, those suffragists, the civil rights activists, they squabbled endlessly with each other. There was hardly an end to their disagreements with each other about strategies, what they should do, how they should do it. We don't need to agree on everything. We don't even need to agree on most things. We only need to agree on this, that democracy is fragile and we are its current safekeepers. I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much. Have I, or am I willing to speak at other homes for the elderly? I have not, and I came here at the invitation of my dear friend Bob Daly, and I've not even known about this part of our wonderful city, and so it's a delight for me to be here. I have spoken a number of times with some Rotary clubs in Dayton and Kettering, and since I've gotten here, but I haven't had the pleasure of doing something like this. Of course, I'd be willing to do that. Another question is, what's the most effective way two old 85-year-olds can defend our democracy? We believe you're right on. Okay, so I love that question. The single most common question that I get in any room is what can I do? I see Americans concerned about what is happening in our country everywhere. And everyone asks, what can I do? Many say, I'm just one person. I just, I don't feel powerful. And when they see firms, like our biggest law firms and biggest corporations doing what they did, it makes them feel like they don't have a chance. And so what can we do? Well, I think everybody can start where they are. I'll tell you what I have done is I've now blown up the phones for my congressmen. I'm always making sure that I call because I have learned that they pay attention to those things. And so hearing from constituents, and I will tell you from the constituents who are most likely to vote, which is older Americans, that is something that our elected representatives pay attention to as they should. And so letting them know what is on your minds is really important. If you thought that slush fund that was just tried to be created was outrageous, then you should call your representatives and let them hear about it. If you thought that it's outrageous to give immunity for future tax audits of the president and the president's family members, if you think that there's something wrong with that, like I think there's something wrong with that as a former federal prosecutor, you should call your representatives and let them know what you think about it. If you're concerned about your democracy, that's one thing that you can do. But we also influence each other, and so having conversations with your friends, with your families, making sure everybody that you know is registered to vote. That's actually a harder thing to do now, and so even checking, as we have to check these days to make sure that our registration, all of that shouldn't be on our minds, but it is, and so those are some of the things that I would say you could do. Tim Snyder always says that we can influence things from where we are. Not everybody has to go out and march in the King's marches. You don't have to do that. But do what you can with the social circles that you have. Another question related to that is, no King's rallies have been an inspiring phenomenon, but what meaningful impact have they had? We can't be sure. But what they do is they do send a message to our government. They send a message that the people are watching, and the people are exercising their voice about what they're seeing. And the numbers really do matter to this administration. So I think that's partly why we've seen them back off of some of their plans. Now, another question is, how can we inform 18 to 30-year-olds on the threat to democracy and their need to save their future? Oh, I love it. I have a 30-year-old myself, and I have younger nieces and nephews too. it's interesting. The Kettering Foundation with Gallup put together a public poll last year, and we polled over 20,000 Americans, and we paid attention to their age groups. And we asked them, do you think democracy is the strongest form of government in the world? And every age group said yes. Every age group. And over 75% of the respondents, nearly 75% of the respondents said that democracy was the best form of governance that there is. The percentage in each one of the age group did go down. And so it was a smaller percent, it was overwhelming in the boomers like me. It was over 80% of boomers. By the time we got down to Gen Z, it was smaller than that, but it was still a majority of them. And so what we know about young people, anybody who's raised any of them knows that they somehow know everything. And then it takes them a little while and a few more years to realize how much they didn't actually know. So we have to talk to them, and we have to challenge them. One thing that I said to my son, my 30-year-old, was, honey, I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I will tell you that you must do something. You think about it and you decide. But you cannot sit this one out. This is not something where Americans sit on the sidelines. If our democracy is in jeopardy, all of us have to do something, and you have to figure out what it's going to be for you. And so he decided years ago that he was going to be a poll worker. And he's one of the youngest poll workers in those things that there are. But I've been very proud that he decided to do that. So we have to talk to our young people. Another question. Yes. How has Project 2025 eroded democracy? Was that their intent? Yeah, I remember the first time I read Project 2025, and it was before the re-election of President Trump, and it was before he began to be questioned about it. And you might remember when he was a candidate that he disavowed it. He said, absolutely, that's not my plan, don't know very much about it, not my plan. But over 50% of the steps that were outlined in Project 2025 have already been taken by this administration. So what they were disavowing when on the campaign trail was something that quickly became what their administration was intending to do. It is intentional. And it thinks of our democracy differently. It would turn back the hands of time. It is a regressive plan for our country, and you can see that. And so yes, the answer to that question, in my view, is yes, it would erode our democracy. I have a question. The New England states do not have a single GOP representative in Congress, in spite of over 40% GOP support in national elections. Isn't this a threat to democracy? It certainly is. Gerrymandering is a practice that has been done by both parties for the same reason. and that is they don't want to be held accountable to voters. The way that we hold our representatives accountable to us is that we know that as we watch them, and if we're not satisfied, we can always kick the bums out the next election. But that's not true, actually, for gerrymandered districts. Sometimes in gerrymandered districts, those maps are drawn by those folks who are going to be running for office again. They draw the maps to capture the voters that they are most confident of so that they won't be defeated and they are not, they don't feel accountable. This is a problem for our nation, and it crosses party lines. Even in Florida, the people of Florida thought that, and they thought it so strongly that in a citizen-led initiative in Florida, they put a referendum on the ballot. They went to the voting booths. They voted to ban gerrymandering by both Democrats and Republicans in their Constitution. They put it in their Constitution. And still, the governor of that state is engaged in creating rigged maps that are gerrymandering those districts. Now, how can that be? Well, it's because they don't actually feel accountable, that they have control over the mechanisms that the people would have to hold them to account. So it is a major problem for democracy. I think that federally, we're going to have to handle this. And that Congress should be able to pass legislation against this on a national level, but we don't have a Congress right now that's going to do that. Do younger people fail to distinguish the benefits of democracy from excesses of capitalism? I think younger people often fail to distinguish benefits of democracy. They have not lived at a time when our democracy was actually in jeopardy. They certainly didn't live at a time when worldwide we were dealing with the ravages of fascism and authoritarianism. And so they may very well underestimate what it would mean not to have a democratic form of governance, but to instead have a kind of strongman leader like Mussolini, Stalin, or worse. So yes, we have to do better at educating our young people at a moment when civics is not playing a role in our public school systems that it needs to play. We're trying to speak to these younger Americans in a variety of ways, in ways that will reach them. One challenge is they don't get their news the way that we traditionally got our news, right? And so we have to come at it in a different way, and often with different voices that they will be influenced by. So it is a real challenge, but it's an important one for us. Somebody asked, how does patriotism differ from democracy? When I think about democracy, I think about a form of governance. I think about it as the form of government where the people reserve the sovereign power of the nation for themselves. That it is the major difference between democracy and a monarchy that we got rid of 250 years ago. was that instead of being ruled by a king, we said we were going to rule ourselves. And we didn't say that we were going to be ruled by the elected representatives that we sent into office. We always reserved the power over the sovereignty to the people themselves. And just because we have a representative government, we never give that power to our government over us. That's the hallmark of democracy. That's the beauty of it. And I think of it as different from patriotism in this sense. I think, as I said in my remarks, that patriotism to me is more than loving being an American. It is being willing to hold our country to account for its missteps, to hold our government responsible for its failings, and demanding that it do better in the future. That to me is the hallmark of patriots, is when we know all of those rights that were guaranteed to us in our Bill of Rights, a big part of our constitutional democracy, were because we wanted to make sure that citizens had protection from their own government, civil liberties, things that the government couldn't do to us when we expressed our views that our government was was heading in the wrong direction. And so to me, being patriotic to our government, the government that was both designed and evolved through all of that citizen action, is making sure that we hold on to that baton, we not lose it, and we pass it on to that next generation of Americans that will follow us. And if we do that, we can consider ourselves to be today's patriots.